Finally, as the debate continues, don't forget about Matt's burden of proof. Uh, he has to show it's unreasonable to believe Jesus rose from the dead. So keep asking this question as you hear his opening statement. Matt says belief in the resurrection is unreasonable because fill in the blank. So as the debate continues, I think you'll see that his reasons that fill in the blank are flawed because they either lead us to one, rejecting many facts of history we already know to be reasonable, and two, they make arbitrary judgments about reality based on Matt's assumptions about the world instead of keeping an open mind about how the world works. So instead of that particular epistemology or way of not, that term will show up a lot, epistemology, that just means the study of knowing. Like, how do we know about the world? How do we figure out what's really going on, okay? So I have a way of figuring out what's going on when it comes to unusual events. I gave a three-pronged test for it. And I hope Matt proposes a way of figuring out how to just discern unusual events and claims of unusual events. And as I said, he'll try to show that this unusual event, the resurrection, is unreasonable because fill in the blank. Why does he think it's unreasonable? And then you'll see those reasons either lead to rejecting other reasonable beliefs or they end up being arbitrary. Instead, I would argue that you should accept the standard that I've offered and then seriously consider the truth and meaning behind Jesus Christ having risen from the dead and consequently demonstrating the truth of the Christian faith.
All right. Thanks, Trent. Matt, whenever you want to start, we will. I'll click the 15-minute timer. No rush.
All right. Thank you. All right. So first of all, thanks for having me here. I appreciate it. It's nice to meet Trent virtually for the first time and to hang out with the Pints with Aquinas crew and fans. Thanks everybody for showing up to this, especially because I didn't do too much to promote it as I had weird technical issues this week. So let's get started. First of all, it is not my intent ever to offend people, but the nature of these discussions about topics that are at the heart of people's deeply held beliefs often offends. I once believed many of the things that many of you believe. I believed many of the things that Trent believed, including a belief in the bodily resurrection. It's difficult to state something like that without someone interpreting it as, oh, now he thinks he's better than us. I don't necessarily think I'm better than any of you as people, but I do believe that my position is more rational. And if that bothers you, I'd ask you to consider whether you think your position is more rational. Because if your answer is yes, then we're in the same boat and we can argue it out. And if your answer is no, then you need to consider why you are willingly, knowingly holding a view that you consider less rational than the alternative. So how do we go about telling if it's reasonable to believe a claim? And then it's worth noting this is separate from whether or not the claim is in fact true. The claim could be false, and yet you could still have a reasonable belief in it. For once upon a time, it was reasonable to believe that the sun went around the earth because that's what we saw when we looked up in the sky. It would have been absurd to think that the earth was spinning at an unbelievable rate, and one of the reasons why I would call it unbelievable. And yet that was the truth. So what's reasonable to believe and what's true are separate. But we're stuck because we may not actually ever have access to the truth. So all we can hope for is what's reasonable. So how do you tell what's reasonable? Well, there's many answers to that, and they are all problematic because in the end of the day, each individual is going to be responsible for determining what's reasonable to them. And the rest of society is going to say, you're unreasonable or you're incredibly reasonable. And so we try to work together. This is one of the reasons why we have scientific methods that remove as much of the bias and subjectivity as possible, even though we can't completely remove it. I'd argue in simplest terms, a claim's reasonable if the claim is consistent with what we know to be true and possible within reality. It simply does no good to argue that it's reasonable because it's internally consistent, because that's true for many sci-fi fantasy stories, or at least some of the best ones. So what does the physical evidence about the resurrection tell us? Well, as far as I'm aware, there is no physical evidence. There's only a story and testimonials. Testimonials about, hey, so-and-so saw this, or this is what happens. If Christianity is true, then the resurrection of Jesus must be the single most important fact in history. And for that fact, we have nothing but hearsay. Now, that hearsay wouldn't be admissible in a court, and certainly the standard, I would think, for adopting the foundation of a religion as true, to the extent that one is willing to conform one's life to it, should at least rise to the level of surviving courtroom evidentiary standards. One might wonder, as I do, if this event actually happened, and there's a good and wise God behind it, why did he leave us with such a paucity of anecdotal evidence and place this event in such a temporal situation as to make it unverifiable and unfalsifiable? Because I'd argue that an untestable claim of a matter of fact, such as this event occurred, no matter what the event is, can never be reasonably believed unless that matter of fact is wholly mundane and when the risk of being wrong is minimized. So if somebody were to say George Washington had a dog named Piggy, the risk of accepting that claim being wrong is fairly trivial. We don't have any way to verify it, as far as I can tell, and it's probably also not falsifiable because we don't have a time machine. We don't have the ability to exhaustively explore every aspect of it. But the risk of being wrong is trivial. Oops, I thought George Washington had a dog named Piggy. Turns out I wasn't right. I guess that's not a big deal. Unless maybe you're on a quiz show in front of millions of people and then you suffer terrible embarrassment and a harm to your reputation. And then all of a sudden, believing something like that is a problem. It's important for people to recognize that there's a difference between verification and falsification. Verification is verification is the concept that we should produce the thing. If we were to say all intelligent beings are on planet Earth, verification, you could run around, hey, there's an intelligent being on Earth, and there's one on Earth, and there's one on Earth, and there's one on Earth. But verifying it exhaustively could be completely impractical because you would have to search every planet at all times in order to determine that, in fact, all intelligent beings are, in fact, on planet Earth. But falsification is a separate issue. Falsification is whether or not it is theoretically able to be shown to be false. And so while we may never be able to verify that all intelligent beings are in fact on planet Earth, we could, at least in theory, falsify it, because if we produced an intelligent being that wasn't on Earth, that would falsify the claim. Now, that would show that the claim is wrong. But if we have a claim that is unverifiable, unfalsifiable, it is essentially untestable. And my foundation is that if you have an untestable claim, it had better be mundane, trivial, and consistent with the facts of reality before you should ever risk believing that it is in fact the case. Well, we can't really believe, or we can't argue that it's rational to believe something that we can't test at all. And so we do the best we can when it comes to history. And so when we take a look at history, all we have are reports. Somebody said they saw this, somebody said they knew this person, somebody said this other thing. That's all well and good when we're trying to put together the best understanding of history we can, but we shouldn't be proclaiming it as truth, and we shouldn't necessarily be saying that this particular version of history is particularly reasonable, because history tends to be written by the victors. And so history is always suspect. And there are two quotes from David Hume that are the cornerstone of how and why I go about determining if something is or should be considered reasonable. The first one is that he said, the wise man proportions his belief to the evidence. And all he's really saying is your confidence level in the truth of a claim should be proportional to the evidence that is there to support it. You barely have any evidence for. And similarly, if there's mountains of evidence of something and you're just like, well, then you're not proportioning your confidence to the belief or to the evidence, sorry. The second quote from Hume, which I'll go ahead and read because it's a little lengthy. When anyone tells me that he saw a dead man restored to life, I immediately consider with myself whether it be more probable that this person should either deceive or be deceived, or that the fact which he relates should have actually happened. I weigh the one miracle against the other, and according to the superiority which I discover, I pronounce my decision and always reject the greater miracle. Now, what Hume is essentially saying there is it more probable that someone has either been deceived or is intending to deceive me than the claim is true? And when he says reject the greater miracle, that is incredibly important and significant to understand. Hume is not saying accept the lesser miracle. That is not it at all. It is reject the greater miracle. It doesn't just say, oh, here's two potential candidate explanations that we have at this particular moment in time. Throw the one out that's more ridiculous and accept the other one. No, it's just you should throw out the one that's more ridiculous. And so if we're hearing a claim that someone rose from the dead, when we have no evidence that this sort of thing is possible or probable, then the greater miracle is that someone rose from the dead versus that someone was deceived or that someone was intending to deceive. that someone was mistaken. Nobody has to lie for any of this. They can just be wrong, or we can just have stories that don't accurately represent the facts at the time. So if a claim isn't falsifiable and there's no way to show it's wrong, we can't reasonably accept that it's correct. And if we're left with no physical evidence about the existence of Jesus or the interactions of Jesus or his death and resurrection, what we're left with is testimony. Now, I'm not willing to dig in on whether or not the Gospels were written by eyewitnesses. I don't think they were. I don't think that most reasonable scholars aren't going to say these are eyewitnesses, but it doesn't matter to me, because even if they were all eyewitnesses, we already know that eyewitness testimony is unreliable under the best circumstances. In this case, we don't know whose testimony, eyewitness second or third hand. We can't investigate it at all. The things that they say happened don't have corroborating evidence. They don't have supporting physical evidence. We don't have any way to question them about their reliability. We don't have any way to talk to them to determine, are these stories accurate? Do they overlap? What we do know is that the Easter narrative from the different Gospels does not line up and cannot be reconciled with the different accounts of it. But in the absence of any physical evidence, we're left with assessing the nature of the claim and the nature of the reports. If it's an extraordinary claim, and it needs to be an extraordinary claim, as it would be really remarkable to say Jesus ate figs for our salvation, the claim needs to be extraordinary because of the narrative. So, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Oh, wait a minute. Is that actually true? Everybody's heard that. I've said it. Other people have said it. I accept that aphorism for what it means, but not as it's written, because all claims require sufficient evidence. And what counts as sufficient evidence to believe a claim is going to differ based on how consistent that claim is with reality. Mundane claims benefit from having a common pool of knowledge and evidence within reality. We know that figs exist. We know that dogs exist. We know that people name their dogs funny things, and it's not extraordinary to think that somebody might name their dog Piggy. We know that figs exist and are eaten, so it's not extraordinary to claim that Jesus ate a fig unless Jesus didn't exist or figs weren't around at that time. Although we have from the Bible a strange claim of Jesus cursing a fig tree for not producing figs when it wasn't in season, which I would argue isn't something that a divine entity knowledgeable about figs and fruit seasons would do. And it seems bizarre to curse a fig tree, but I can't say whether or not that actually happened. Maybe it didn't happen and it's just there to teach another lesson. I have a hard time going through some of these things and saying, yes, that's being reported as this actually happened. So what evidence do we have? Copies of translations of copies from unknown sources that may have been, but probably weren't eyewitnesses. And even if they had been eyewitnesses, it wouldn't be sufficient to confirm that someone actually rose from the dead. What sort of evidence would we expect for a claim where someone rose from the dead? It depends on the time frame. Sure, back in first century Judea, probably not a lot. You don't have a way to test for sure that somebody's dead. You don't have like x-rays. You don't have DNA. But the question is, if this story is true, then Jesus was divine and God exists. And what sort of evidence could a God provide? Well, God could provide the best evidence possible, such that there would be no reasonable debate to be had at all. Theists often claim that it's more believable because it's a miracle. It's more believable because the first people to the tomb were women and women weren't trusted. Nobody would put these details in, so therefore they must be true. But that's like saying, that's exactly what the butler would say if he did do it. If it's on par or worse than the evidence offered by someone trying to sell me a bridge, someone trying to get me started in as their underling in a multi-level marketing campaign, or the money that my Nigerian prince has set aside for me, then the evidence isn't strong and no amount of pretending will change that. It is unreasonable to believe it because there isn't sufficient evidence. No physical evidence. Nothing about this claim would pass muster today. There's no body, no tomb, no blood, no sword, no cross, no DNA, no burial rags despite the fake Shroud of Turin, no witnesses to question currently, no crime scene investigators, no findings of fact at all. I understand and appreciate, as I'm a former believer, that there are testimonies here that people find compelling. And I could probably speculate as to what it is that convinces people and what it is that keeps people in belief. But it is not the physical evidence. It is not what is reasonable. It is probably the extraordinary narrative, the emotive, the emotion that people feel and connect with it, fear of finding out you are wrong, fear of dying and not going on to an eternal paradise, fear of being the odd one out when everybody around you believes. I have experienced those same concerns. For the Christians out there who believe this, and you believe all kinds of supernatural things, and many of you believe in demons and angels and all of the things that go along with this because you've accepted the supernatural. The only reason this feels reasonable to people is because they've already accepted other things that aren't reasonable to accept. We have no way currently to investigate or confirm the supernatural at all. We can't confirm that anything supernatural exists. We can't confirm that anything supernatural interacts with reality. And to say that, well, we've seen the writings of these people who we don't know, we can't investigate from a long time ago, and it's just so darn extraordinary, and we can't think of a better explanation than it likely happened, therefore it's reasonable to believe it. I cannot get on board with that, and it frustrates me that other people can't see this, because if I were to come to you with the story like this today, if it didn't have the history and the baggage, not of actually being true, but of being convincing enough to foster a bunch of followers, nobody would reasonably, all right, let me take that back. Almost nobody would argue that they could reasonably accept it today. And many of the people who are accepting these sorts of claims are also at odds with science, and it frustrates me that someone could, I don't know, fear getting a vaccine for fear of being microchipped or it being the mark of the beast while they accept claims that don't have good evidence.